Throughout his lifetime, Sauron had a wide range of servants, orcs, men, and even beasts, though none of these came anywhere close to the Nazgul in their importance to Sauron. He knew that he could always rely upon them even for the most dire challenges, and out of all of his servants, the Nazgul could never betray him, for their will was practically enslaved. But what exactly were they enslaved to? To Sauron, to the Nine Rings, or to the One Ring? And was there any way for them to break this enslavement? Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode we'll be discussing how Sauron controlled the Ringwraiths. Now, to understand the Nazgul's connection to Sauron, we must first have a look at their origins. These creatures were once powerful kings and lords of men that were ensnared by Sauron through his gift of the Nine Rings of Men. These rings would slowly corrupt them, and it made them subservient to the bearer and creator of the One Ring. And this allowed Sauron to transform these once mighty men into the Nazgul, the perfect instrument of his will, for they would obey his command without question. Now, this is where things start to get a lot more complicated, because we have to break down the relationship between the Nine Rings of the Nazgul and the One Ring. So it seems that the Rings of the Nazgul were the object of their enslavement, and they could actually be controlled by them. We know that sometime in their history, Sauron took the Nazgul's rings and he kept them in his possession. The unfinished tales tell us that the Ringwraiths, who had no will but his own, being utterly subservient to the ring that had enslaved him, which Sauron held. Another relevant quote from the books says that they were by far his most powerful servants and the most suitable for such a mission, since they were entirely enslaved to their Nine Rings, which he now himself held. So if the Nazgul were utterly enslaved to the Rings of Power, was it possible to control them if he somehow managed to possess their rings? Now we're going to have to interpret these quotes, and the way I understand them is that even though the Rings of the Nazgul were the object of their enslavement, we must keep in mind that the power of these rings and their corrupting effect came from Sauron's skill and magic, and he bound all of these rings of power to the One Ring. And so my interpretation is that even though the Nazgul were utterly enslaved to their own rings, what they were actually enslaved to, or by, was Sauron's corrupting power, which bound their rings to the One Ring, and which contained his essence, his will, and his power. So if someone had to possess the Nazgul's ring, they wouldn't be able to change its corrupting effect, or break its link to the One Ring, and so they still wouldn't be able to control them. As always, I'd like to emphasize that this is my own interpretation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Now, if the Nine Rings of the Nazgul were bound to the One Ring, was it possible for someone to control them if they held the One Ring? Once again, this is quite a complicated question, though luckily Tolkien actually discussed it in one of his letters, Letter 246. In this letter, Tolkien wrote that when Frodo wore the ring upon Weathertop, he was acting out of fear, and his only focus was to use the ring to turn invisible, and he never tried to control the Nazgul. By the time Frodo reached Mount Doom, his character had matured and grown, and even his experience at controlling the ring had increased significantly, so much so that he could have tried to command the Nazgul. To quote, "Sauron sent at once the Ringwraiths. They were naturally fully instructed, and in no way deceived as to the real lordship of the ring. The wearer would not be invisible to them, but the reverse, and the more vulnerable to their weapons. But the situation was now different to that under Weathertop, where Frodo acted merely in fear, and wished only to use, in vain, the ring's subsidiary power of conferring invisibility. He had grown since then. Would they have been immune from its power if he claimed it as an instrument of command and domination? Not wholly. I do not think they could have attacked him with violence, nor laid hold upon him or taken him captive. They would have obeyed, or feigned to obey, any command of his that did not interfere with their errand, laid upon them by Sauron, who still, through their 9 rings which he held, had primary control of their wills. That errand was to remove Frodo from the crack. Once he lost the power or opportunity to destroy the ring, the end could not be in doubt. Tolkien goes on to say that the situation as between Frodo with the ring and the Eight might be compared to that of a small brave man armed with a devastating weapon, faced by 8 savage warriors of great strength and agility armed with poisoned blades. The man's weakness was that he did not know how to use his weapon yet, and he was by temperament and training averse to violence. Their weakness, that the man's weapon was a thing that filled them with fear, as an object of terror in their religious cult, by which they had been conditioned to treat one who wielded it with servility. I think they would have shown him servility. They would have greeted Frodo as Lord. With fair speeches, they would have induced him to leave the Sammat Nur, for instance to look upon his new kingdom, and behold afar with his sight the abode of power that he must now claim and turn to his own purposes. Once outside the chamber while he was gazing, some of them would destroy the entrance. From this we can see that, with the right focus, Frodo could partially command the Nazgul, since it was in their nature to serve the bearer of the One Ring, though they still wouldn't follow any orders that opposed those of Sauron. This would mean that the user of the One Ring could exert some degree of control over them, though ultimately they would always answer to Sauron's will. I imagine it's because the One Ring contained Sauron's power and essence, and so even if someone possessed it, they could never fully control the ring, since it would always yearn to be reunited with Sauron, for it was only loyal to him. Now there is a very interesting scenario in which someone could actually claim the One Ring's loyalty and break its bond with Sauron. According to Tolkien, there was a chance that Gandalf could master the One Ring and claim its loyalty. Once again, the quote is from letter 246. It would be a delicate balance. On one side, the true allegiance of the ring to Sauron. On the other, superior strength, because Sauron was not actually in possession, and perhaps also because he was weakened by long corruption and expenditure of will in dominating inferiors. If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been for Sauron the same as the destruction of the ring. For him it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all of its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. In this case, if Gandalf managed to claim the One Ring, its bond with Sauron would be broken, and this would give Gandalf control over all the works of Sauron that were linked with the One Ring, which included the 9 rings of men. And so I believe that, if this scenario had to play out, Gandalf could technically control the Nazgul. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully it wasn't too complicated, as I felt like it was kind of hard to sort it all out, more so since it's an interpretation. Do you guys agree with my thoughts? Or do you believe there was some other way to control the Nazgul? And how do you think Gandalf might have used them, assuming he became the new Dark Lord? I'm sure that there are quite a few interesting answers to this question, so try and come up with some and share them in the comments. I'd love to see some creative ideas on Gandalf's evil missions for the Nazgul. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all my patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help and support are deeply appreciated, particularly my Valar tier patrons, Michelangelo and T. Gorman, and also my Wizard tier patrons, Andrew Bomer, James Togel, Mike Feeney, and Roland Mervold. If you too would like to support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store, or by following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.